All right, what's up, everybody? So, part 5 now of the boot camp. This is our last session, um, and today, as you'll see, we're doing some post flop play and heads up play. I know in sit and goes, post flop play is kind of non existent for many players, but if you start using a lot of the strategies that we've been talking about in the previous sessions, you're going to be playing some more hands, and naturally you're going to be involved in some more post-flop scenarios. So we need to make sure that our post-flop game is up to par as well. Um, and we're also going to talk about heads-up play. Heads-up play is, again, it's another topic that really isn't discussed a whole lot. I think what most people have done is resorted to stuff like Nash equilibrium and some basic heads up stuff that I think is leaving a lot of money on the table. And no matter what game you're playing, coming in first place, there's nothing better for your ROI than finishing in first place a lot. So, your in the money might be good. We also need to make sure that the heads up play is good, because if you look at your in the money distribution, you could do that through SharkScope or your own Hold'em manager, and you find you're coming in second place more than first place. Well, it could be a variety of issues. Maybe you're not picking up enough chips along the way to give you a good stack for in the money, but it could also just be, you're just simply losing heads up. So hopefully we'll go through some strategies here that will help. Now, I will say both of these topics are extremely expansive. There's no one way to play post flop. There's tons of variables in playing post flop. We're not getting into every single post flop scenario. We're not getting into every heads up play scenario. What we're going to be talking about are strategies and some general strategies. We will be going through some hands to illustrate certain points. But remember, a lot of what we're doing is not robotic. It's just getting you to think. So these are more plays that you can think about, add into your repertoire, maybe have you playing a little bit different than you currently playing post flop or heads up. As I was preparing this session, I found that I had to really cut it back, or else this session could have been about 5 hours long because of how much information you can get into. I will say, I think what I'm planning on doing is doing actually a follow-up to this video, which I'll give everybody. We don't need to necessarily have a session on it. I'll just, so we could say there's going to be a session 5 part 2 where maybe we get in some more detail about specific hands, and spend a couple hours on that as well. So I will make sure everybody gets that as well. So just to recap, where we've gone over these past 4 sessions, we've set up the HUD. We've talked about exploiting players in a lot of different scenarios, whether it's opening any 2 cards, putting together some anti-strategies based upon how we know you're supposed to play. And last session we talked about analyzing the push-fold game, and that you can actually raise fold and raise call, but actually more importantly, raise fold down to 10, 9, 8 big blinds, even a little bit lower. A lot of what we talked about in session 4 will definitely apply to our heads-up game, and we'll get into that as well. So, if you haven't seen session 4 yet, I definitely recommend checking that out first before this one, certainly. So today, as I said, we're going to be talking about some post-flop play and heads-up play. When it comes to post-flop, c-betting is a very hot topic. I'm pretty much posed with the question, it seems like once a day, what are good flops to c-bet? Should we be double barreling? We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about when and when not to. And again, there's always going to be generalities. Every situation is going to be different. We're going to be basing upon some general scenarios and when and why to adapt from the norm. And when we get it to heads up, it's time to exploit our opponents again. We're getting away from the unexploitable play, because the unexploitable play is just simply leaving too much money on the table. So let's jump into post-flop play. So this is kind of basic stuff. I agree. C-betting. Or maybe if it's not basic, then it's good that we review this. But when to C bet, like I said, post flop play is kind of non-existent when it comes to sit and goes. But with the amount of times we're going to be opening, stealing, there are going to be times where we get called or even doing a limp steal. We really have to nail down our post flop play, and C betting is obviously a big part. Many times when you raise, get called, you C bet. For the most part, unless you're deep stack, it's going to be for a good amount of your chips. So again, we have to make sure our bet sizing is correct when we do it is correct. And a lot of the times, what determines when to C bet is, of course, board texture, player dependent. Of course, there's some other factors where you are in the game, but definitely board texture and obviously the player. We'll talk a lot more about board texture because, of course, it's pretty obvious what players you should or shouldn't C bet based upon the stats. If you have the fold to C bet stats staring at you in the face and it's saying 100% fold to C bet, well, I think we should be C betting every board. It would probably be wrong not to. Versus the guy who's got a 20% fold to C bet over even 10 hands. Obviously, he's not folding a lot, so you should be a little bit more cautious. So that's kind of obvious stuff. When we talk about good boards to C bet, what I'm looking for are high card boards, ace high boards, king high boards, queen high boards. They're very easy to represent. And we're going to get into bet sizing, so I won't jump into that yet. I have a separate section on bet sizing. I think sometimes people tend to disagree with me on this one. It's always a discussion of suited boards, meaning all hearts, all spades, clubs, whatever. I actually like C betting those boards. And the reason I like C betting is because simply if the other opponent doesn't have one of those suits, they're most likely to fold. So I don't think we need to bet big. And like I said, we'll get into some bet sizing. But those are boards I like to C bet. Paired boards, like 10-10-4, something like that, when the board's paired, they can be good to C bet. They also lend themselves to check raising from guys that are calling you with some pocket pairs. So sometimes they're good boards to C bet. Good players to C bet. Well, let me jump back real quick. Anybody agree, disagree on these? Think there's some other spots to take a look at? It's kind of straightforward and basic, I think, but it's just going to set up what we're going to talk about here coming up. What are your guys' thoughts on suited boards? Do you like C betting them? Do you typically do it? And I guess I'll keep talking if anybody wants to give their opinion on it, what they like to do on the suited boards. I personally like C betting them because I think, like I said, if they don't have that suit, they're so likely to fold. Of course, the loose, crazy players, they'll still probably call you down with top pair and whatnot. But yeah, Paul, that's a good point. And I probably should actually put that in here about when to C bet in one opponent, multiple opponents. Most of the time, we want to do it against one opponent. If you're against two opponents and it's a high card dry board, like ace 5-9 or something like that, no suits, and you're going against two opponents, perfectly fine with throwing out a small C bet because it's easy to represent the ace, and if they don't have the ace, they're most likely folding. So perfectly fine there. Multiple opponents on a suited board, though, or on a pretty juicy board, I'll probably just let it go. And good players to C bet against. Most regs play, fit or fold. They may call with a pocket pair. If they don't hit, they'll just let it go. So I like playing against regs post flop if they are calling, even though they don't call a ton. That's probably more for the early game. If they do call, there are some tougher players that I know like to call, even out of position with, say, suited Broadways or Broadway hands in general. I know there are a few guys in the 18-mans when I was playing on Stars that they were very good players. If you were stealing from, say, hijack cutoff button, they, instead of 3-betting, they actually elected to flat from, say, the big blind with hands like King Jack and Queen 10. And their plan usually was, if the board wasn't too bad for them, if it was just a high card board, they would float out of position, then look to take it down, possibly on the river if you check it back. So against guys like that, I will often double barrel. And like I said, we're going to get into some double barrel stuff today as well. So I double barrel regs probably more than anybody when I'm faced against them. And like I said, players with high fold to C bet percentage, pretty straightforward. No big deal there. Um, the question is, though, when should we actually check back the flop? When is c betting maybe not necessarily incorrect, but when do we think that c betting is just not the best play? And that's when I put in something called the delayed c bet. And before I start going through that, is anybody familiar with the delayed c bet? Do they use it? Do you know when to use it? Why to use it? Yeah, but I know I've spoken to several of you about it as well. Yep, so use the delayed c bet when it can hit the range, usually when the board has small cards. Yep, so I know I've already spoken to a few of you about this as well, but there's a delayed c bet, and I don't think it's used often enough, or maybe people aren't thinking about it a whole lot. But delayed c bet, turn c bet, whatever you want to call it, and it's pretty straightforward with how it works. You're obviously just checking the flop, betting, and typically when you're in position. This is really only when it's when you mainly do it. I'd say 90% of the time is when you're in position. Check the flop and bet any turn. Um, so when to do it, like I said, in position, I actually like to do it on very dry boards that may lend themselves to being check raised. Like on a 7-4 deuce rainbow type of board. Players who maybe called you with pocket pairs, even ace high hands, or just aggressive opponents in general, will check raise that board because they expect that you didn't hit it as well. So boards that are very difficult to represent, I may elect to do a delayed c bet. And like I said, against in general an aggressive opponent. And also doing a delayed c bet on paired boards. Remember I said before, sometimes paired boards can be good to c bet. Other times they also lend themselves to being check raised with, say, a pocket pair because it's less likely that we hit it as well. So your more aggressive opponents will look to check raise those boards as well. So why do we do the delayed c bet? Um, Again, it prevents check raising. It could be the path of least resistance, and in general, it takes away players' aggression. So if somebody was going to make a move on you, it's usually going to be on the flop. They have that pocket pair. Maybe they have some sort of draw. Maybe it's just ace high. If they're going to check raise you, the majority of the time it's going to happen on the flop because they also expect you to c bet. C betting is such a common part of today's game that everybody expects when you bet, you're going to follow up with a c bet on the flop. So if you're always supposed to do it, there's some players that will try to take advantage of that. They typically will not do it on the turn. So if you have ace high yourself, but you can't call a check raise, or maybe you potentially have some outs that you could hit. Maybe you flop a some type of draw. Maybe you have ace king and the flop comes queen jack, and that's not necessarily the driest board in the world, but that board tends to lend itself to potential some check raises. It hits a part of their range, so you have two overs and even a gut shot. Um, so if you have some outs, you could actually give yourself a free card. And what obviously we're looking for is the opponent to check the flop and then check the turn. Once they go check check, it gives us a good idea that they obviously don't really have a hand here. So that could be the time where we can c bet and on the turn and take it down. And your c bet on the turn, because it's less likely to have something when they go check check, your c bet does not have to be big at all. 30-40% of the pot, and we'll go through some hands and talk about that. Obviously, there are some disadvantages with this play. It doesn't, work every single time the way we plan it. Of course, we can give our opponent a free card when maybe they would have folded on the flop to a c bet, or if they don't go check check, they lead out into us. And this is a typical scenario. You get somebody calling from the big blind, for example, and they're out of position. That they lead out on the turn, we still missed, we'll probably have to fold in that sense. So I like the delayed c bet for the reasons I mentioned here. And like I said, we're going to go through a couple hands of when I've done it. And I just think it's a nice play to add in, mix up your play. Um, you don't have to c bet every single time because look at everybody expects you to be c betting. So it's nice to mix it up as well. So, any questions with the delayed c bet? Kind of straightforward, but I think it's good to at least talk about it to get you thinking to add it in. So, any questions on this? All right. So let's get into. So I'm gonna keep going, Jorge. If you have a question, just fire away. Jorge, you can ask the question if you were going to. I'll go back to here. It all depends. It all depends. I mean, too low. Yeah, board dependent. But remember why we're betting so low. Our opponent just went check check, and we're going to talk about bet sizing here in a second. Um, if the opponent just went check check, why do we have to bet 50, 50% or 60% to represent the board? Like I said, obviously it's board dependent as well, a little bit. But when opponent goes check check, I'm assuming they don't really have much, and they're going to fold whether I bet 40% or 50%. So if I missed, I'm going to try to risk less to win the same amount, and therefore it doesn't have to work as frequently to be profitable. And I'm actually just about to get into some bet sizing as well. I would say that when we get into some lower bet sizing, I will, and I'll probably talk about this as we get into bet sizing as well. But it also depends on what stage you're at in the game, how big is the pot compared to your stack. If you're getting up to the middle stages of the game and blinds are 100, 200, 200, 400, your c betting in general doesn't need to be so big, and accordingly your turn bets because the chips represent represent a larger portion of your stack. How do you know if you can vary your bet sizes versus an opponent based upon the strength of your hand? We're gonna talk about that. I'll get into that when we start going through some examples. There's some times where I'll bet a full pot into my opponent, but those are more of a case by case basis. Like you have. Oh, let me get into bet sizing. We're gonna get into that. So, in general, I think I keep my bet sizing smaller than most people keep it. Most of my c betting is around 50%. Sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, maybe 55. But in general, I'm around 50%. I would say most likely actually 45%. Whether you hit or miss, you hit ace high, fine, bet the same amount that you would if you had king queen and you missed on ace high. And what betting small does is a few things. One, when you miss and your opponent hits, you risk less. Two, you can, by betting smaller, you can get value from hands that may be scared off by when people bet bigger. I find bet sizing is one of the most common mistakes that most players have when they're playing post flop. They want to represent the ace on an ace high board or a king, and they bet 60% of the pot. Let me pose a scenario to you. Let's say you have king queen, you raise from the button. Flop comes ace nine deuce, so obviously really no draws, no suits, complete rainbow flop, and you get called out of the big blind. And let's just say the pot is 300. Do we ever need to bet more than 150 to represent the ace on that type of board versus a player out of position on an ace high board, no draws? What are they really going to be calling us with? If I bet 130, 140 into a 300 pot, I imagine I'm going to get the same calls, raises, or folds than I would if I bet, 220 into a 300 pot. On those types of boards, my assumption is the players either hit it or they didn't hit it. And when that's the case, you have to really bet according to what you want to accomplish. What's your goal? Obviously, if you have king queen, there's an ace high, you're happy to just take it down. So think about what your opponent's capable of calling with, and bet it accordingly. And of course, this is going to work a lot against your fishy players that you really don't have to balance your range. But even against regs, if a reg calls you ace high board, do we really need to represent the ace by betting big? And accordingly, if I did hit the ace, I would probably bet 30, 40% as well. Or, like I said, 40% or even low as 30%. If they do, if that sizing is enticing for them to call. But in general, I'd say in between 40 to 50% is where my C betting size is. And also, it allows you to double barrel easier. When you fire out 60% on the flop, what are you firing out on the turn? It's getting very, very expensive. So if you bet 40% on the flop, you can maybe even go pretty small on the turn, and the double barrel in itself looks strong. So the sizing won't necessarily have to matter a ton. Other spots like where to deviate. Like I said, if you have a made hand on a draw heavy board versus a fish, bet bigger. You have pocket aces on like a 9-10 jack board or something. I'm fine with betting bigger there. Get them to commit. And one thing I think a lot of people forget about is, especially if you find yourself slow playing or maybe not getting your chips in the middle fast enough, is that let's say there is a draw heavy board. It's not whether, what's our opponent capable of calling us with. Also factor in, we have the best hand right now. Can we get our opponent committed right now with top pair and a draw, let's say when we have pocket aces, or second pair and a draw, something like that, where we're clearly ahead, and can we get them committed before the action gets killed? So if you're on a board like, again 9-10 queen, you have pocket aces, you raise, and maybe your opponent re-raises you small. Get it in there. I'm just kind of throwing out examples on the fly here. Maybe they're not the best examples in the world, but what I'm saying is get it in for also the reason that there's cards that can kill your action on later streets. Like on a 9-10 queen board, obviously a jack could potentially kill the action. On a 9-10 jack board, obviously queen kills the action, king can kill the action, 8 can kill the action. So you want to get it in, especially versus these players when you're clearly ahead and they're capable of calling with worse hands. So many times I don't see people raise big enough or get it in when they should, and the next thing you know, they're losing value because they're no longer going to get that player to commit on the turn or river because now there's 4 to a straight or 4 to a flush on the board. Make sense so far? All right, so hopefully that answered your question a little bit about varying your bet size. In general, though, I'd say most of my C bets are in this range. There's times where we could deviate, and it's just a matter of more understanding rather than saying when this happens we have to do this. That's not what this is at all. That's not what this whole course has been about. It's more understanding our opponents and what our bet sizes are really saying. So accordingly with bet sizes, let's talk about double barreling a little bit. Who double barrels here? Who doesn't double barrel? What's your guys' concerns about double barreling? And if you do it, when do you do it? Should observe the opponent's fold to flop turns. Check where he folds. Definitely. Always looking at opponents. Yep. So as you guys are writing this, one thing I definitely always recommend is, I'm not sitting here saying that I'm also the master in post-flop play. There's a lot of ways to play post-flop. Some are definitely better than others. Definitely watch some cash game videos on various, subscription sites, stuff like that. Look at those cash game videos, and learn how to play. Read opponents, put opponents on ranges. That's the way I learned a lot, was by watching actually cash game and playing a lot of cash games as well, of how to play some post flop a little bit better. So low boards, ace high, card on turn. Yep. So you're all kind of right around the same area. Went to double barrel. And again, we're going to be faced. When you start adding in the strategies that we've spoken about, like for example the limp steal, you're naturally going to the flop. there's going to be time that I think on the limb steal is probably when I end up double barreling the most. We're out of position. I don't always want to get in the mode of I limp, I stab at the pot, he calls, I fold, I check fold on the turn. I don't want to get into that pattern. So one thing to look at when double barreling is like where I said here about if there's low cards on the board and ace high comes on the turn. Great card to double barrel. If an opponent was calling with pocket pairs or even just floating on the flop, when we double barrel an ace, it makes it very, very difficult for our opponent to continue. So I agree with that. And of course, we always want to look at opponents. In a perfect world, we are going to have flop, turn, river, c-bet values. A lot of the guys that are going to be calling us down, though, are also random players. And for the most part, we're not going to be having a lot of those stats readily available. Maybe you have a couple hands, and that's it. So, yes, in a perfect world, we'd be able to see, look, this guy never folds the flop, but folds the turn every single time. That'd be a very easy way to say, hey, we got to double barrel every single time. That's not always going to be the case. So, when to do it, good turn cards, just like we just spoke about, doesn't commit you. I think that also gets back to bet sizing. Making a small flop bet, 40, 50%, no more than 50%, will allow you to continue to make a double barrel bet on the turn, and without being committed. You don't want to find yourself, starting to dump off your stack. If you find you're just too shallow, so be it. You don't want to start bluffing off your stack unless you have a really good reason to. And another reason to double barrel, and this is something that I find I do a lot more than a lot of players, is, and it just, I like it. I don't like to make hero calls on the river. I think it can get expensive turning hands in the bluff catchers. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. What I like to do is many times double barrel small to see a cheaper river, if that makes sense. So let's say we bet the flop. Let's say we have like second pair. The flop is queen, jack, something. We have a jack. We're in position. We bet the flop. We get called. The turn comes a blank. What do we do? You could check, and then when you check, though, many times that'll open up river bluffs. Which may be difficult. Obviously you could say, well, maybe we want to induce some bluffs. Again, in a perfect world, sure, but it's very tough to do if that bluff becomes too big. It just puts us in a really tough spot sometimes. So what I like to do is double barrel to see a cheaper river with some showdown value, but also get some value as well. So let's say it's queen, jack. We have a jack. We bet the flop. Betting the turn for like 30, 40%, the double barrel does two things. We could be getting some value from draws still. It prevents us. It's kind of like a turn blocker bet, where since we've double barreled, and if he calls again, he's likely to check back the river as well. And when he does that, we can then check back comfortably the river. And the bet that we made on the turn might be less than we would have to call on the river, if that makes sense. And I like doing that as well when you have some showdown value, but let's say even like 4 to a straight came out. Checking on those types of boards can really lend itself to some bluffs, and it makes it really hard to call when it's really draw heavy and you have top pair, even top 2 pair. Making small turn double barrels or turn bets in general can allow you to see cheaper rivers and allow you to check down and show your hand down. So, does that make sense in that? I know, like I said, we're going to hopefully get into, we're going to be getting into some specific hands. I think, as I mentioned, I'm going to be doing a follow-up video. I'll hopefully get into some more scenarios like that. That's actually one of my favorite plays to do, is for this reason here, potentially seeing a cheaper river by actually double barreling small. Does that make sense? Do we have any questions on that? All right. So obviously, there's going to be times where we shouldn't do it. Again, opponent, player dependent. If he's a calling station, don't be, thick-headed and just keep raising into them. You'll just make life miserable. Another reason not to double barrel would be you can improve on the next street. I was just doing a hand interview with a guy yesterday, and I wanted to get his hand, but he wasn't online today. He had ace queen of diamonds, and the flop came like king high with one diamond. He c-bet, the guy called, and he was in position. And the flop brought another diamond, and I believe it was a 10. So essentially what happened was on the turn, he picked up a straight draw, a gut shot straight draw from the river. He picked up the flush draw, and he's got an ace as well. So he's left himself with a lot of outs. When you have outs in that scenario, I'm more likely to check it back so that I give myself that free card rather than double barreling and potentially getting check raised on the turn, and now we have to give up because, for obvious reasons, we're probably just not having enough odds to draw there. So when you can improve on the next street, after your c-bet, maybe you miss, but all of a sudden the turn brings some type of draw or it gives you some outs on the river, check it back. When you can improve, give yourself that free card. And obviously bad turn cards, we don't necessarily want to double barrel because you're likely to get called. If a deuce comes, it's better to double barrel an ace than necessarily an ace is easy to double barrel. A deuce isn't a very good card to double barrel in most scenarios. So understand what the bad cards are and the good cards are. I tend to semi-bluff bet many of these opportunities. I'm not saying that it's wrong or that it's bad. I'd like to give myself that free card. Let's say, for example, he had that ace queen, right? And maybe he didn't pick up that flush draw. I think the flush draw giving you that many outs is something I definitely want to check back. I don't bet in position, check back out of position. Okay, I'll explain that in a second. I'm mainly talking about, in position here. When I'm talking about picking up a draw and improving on the next street, I'm talking about playing in position. I'll talk about out of position in a second. So I don't think it's necessarily bad to semi-bluff, but I'm always concerned about potentially getting check raised off of my hand. So I definitely want to prevent that from happening. And, for example, let's say we have, and I know this is probably more of a cash game hand. I was going to say, if you have like pocket aces, you bet, you get called, and the turn card comes and it gives you maybe a flush draw. Like there's 3 hearts and you have the ace of hearts with pocket aces. You may want to check it back on that board because you have the nut flush draw for the river. Whereas if you didn't have the ace of hearts, it'd be better to possibly even raise fold in certain scenarios. You're not very often going to be folding pocket aces post flop in a sit and go. That'd be more in a cash game. But the concept still applies. If you can improve, give yourself the opportunity to improve. If you can't improve, then more likely to double barrel. I would. So Paul, back to your point, I would be checking in position and actually out of position. When you check, many times you're potentially giving up, and you don't know how big someone's going to bet. You'd like to think, you know what, I'll check, maybe give myself a free card, or maybe I'll check call for my odds, or to hit my outs. I may go back to the potentially seeing a cheaper river. If you can bet kind of small in the turn to allow yourself to see the river cheaper, that could be an option as well. A lot of it, of course, has to do with our opponent. We're talking in generalities. Yeah, no worries. But like I said, I want to keep the bet sizing small because, like I said, double barreling is very strong as is. Most people don't do it, so there's no need to bet like 60% of the pot, 60% of the pot. 40%, and then 40% again, or even 30%. Sometimes I bet even smaller on the turn. It looks very strong, and will most of the time get people to fold. So that's my thoughts on double barreling. When you get into triple barreling, many times there's no, when's the best time to triple barrel or not. You really have to be sure that maybe a guy's on a draw and you don't have showdown value. I'd say if I was If I was going to triple barrel, it'd be I had no showdown value. I really thought the guy was on a draw, and we ship it in. I'm not going to get in a ton of triple barreling. Yesterday I seemed to be triple barrel happy. I think it happened 3 times within several games. 2 out of 3 times it worked. The other time it knocked me out, but I think these are the more common scenarios: c betting and double barreling. Because, like I said, you're going to find yourself in these spots a lot more when you start bringing in the limp steel. When you just naturally start raising more hands, look, you're going to get called once in a while, and you're not going to expect it. Well, that doesn't mean we all is lost when we go to post flop. Know what your goal is, understand stack sizes, and when good time to c-bet and not c-bet and double barrel. So, any questions on the double barreling stuff? Makes sense? I think the 2 important points to take away from the double barreling, though, is this point here. Potentially seeing a cheaper river. We don't always just have to check it back on in position when we have like second pair or some showdown value. If you are doing that, you might find yourself faced with some really tough river decisions. I really like to prevent tough river decisions. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. When we're wrong, it's really expensive. So I like to minimize that exposure. And the other important point to take away is if you can improve on the next street. I think that's a good reason not to double barrel sometimes, is when you've picked up a bunch of outs, hey, give yourself that free card. There's no need to, keep firing away at it, if you have those outs. If you don't have outs, then I'm more likely to double barrel. And, even if I only pick up like a gut shot, I still may double barrel. But if you have like 2 overcards, a flush draw and a straight draw, maybe a better opportunity to check it back and give yourself those outs. So, I'm not saying I always do this in every single scenario, but it's, I probably check it back when I have outs more often than not. All right. Any questions on that stuff? Cool. And I think double barreling is a nice thing to add to your game since most people don't do it. Not everything has to come down to c-betting, getting called, and then just giving up. I think most regs do that. They kind of play fit or fold. They're a little bit scared to double barrel. I agree. And when I first started, I was scared to double barrel. I thought it was too expensive to risk, but that was in my unexploitable, straightforward ABC days. Now we can get a little bit more tricky. All right, so tell me what you guys do in both of these scenarios. Let's talk about the most dreaded scenario we have. We have pocket aces, you raise, and somebody calls, and that friggin' ace comes on the board, and you're pissed off. What do you do when you're in position and when you're out of position on the flop? So I'll let you guys fire away. Because I see this mistake way too many times, and people not able to get away from pocket kings. All right, so a couple different. We have Paul saying he would check it in position, bet out of position. We've got out of position, usually c-bet, then give up. In position, pot control, and call at least 1 street. Jorge, in position, double barrel, and check river. Opponent calls 2 streets and fold the river sometimes against aggressive opponents. There's out of position. Okay. So a couple different options. And of course, look, again, everything that we're talking about is player dependent. I'm going to talk about what I do the majority of the time. Yeah, I mean, you would think. So in regards to this comment, opponents rarely have an ace in their range when calling. You would think so. Against a lot of opponents, that's, yeah, I mean, medium and lower stakes, they definitely do. Just in general, whatever you're playing. If you have a fishy player, look, they're calling out of the blinds with ace-5, and it happens. Whether it's a good player or not, most of the time it's not. It happens. So, and we've all been faced with this scenario. I'll tell you what I do, and this is my general play. In position, I check back kings on an ace high board almost every single time. Out of position, I'm usually leading out and c-betting and pretty much giving up if called. So let's talk about why that is. Like I said, about 90% of the time I'm checking behind because, I mean, think about it. What are you going to get called with? Like, when you c-bet, what's the point of betting? Yeah, 3 more players just give up. Again, we're talking more in, one opponent. What hands are calling you? Well, let's go back to that ace-9 deuce board that we talked about before, that rainbow. What is the point of c-betting kings on that board? What hand's ever going to call you to get value, where you can get value? You're not afraid of any turn cards coming that can complete a draw, that are scare cards. We have the second best pair here, so we're not afraid of anything. If you have jacks, for example, on an ace high board, there is good reason to c-bet on an ace high board because a king or a queen could come out. There's outs that could. We're giving our opponent outs to hit an overpair to our jacks. Not the same thing with kings. So you have to figure out what's the point of our c-bet. Are we ever really getting value? And when we get called, it's usually only by hands that are beating us. Okay? So I'm most likely checking it back. If they check back the turn, I'll probably throw out a really small turn bet to get some value. Maybe there's a draw now on the turn. Maybe he hit a pair, and when our check back tells him that we didn't hit our ace. So that's my usual play in position because I don't see the value in c-betting. And we're very rarely going to get much value in general on that board with kings. So at a position, though, I feel that we definitely need the c-bet. Checking is potentially just giving up. You check, a guy fires at a bet. Are you going to check call out of position? Then you check again on the turn, he fires again. Are you going to call again? I just don't see the point in turning our kings into a bluff catcher. I would most likely c-bet half the pot or even 40%. And if he calls, I'm just getting away from it. It's one of those hands where I think most people, or many people that can't get rid of their kings, are losing a big pot or winning a small one. We've probably all heard that cliche statement, but it's definitely true on a pocket kings hand with an ace-high board. So, anybody disagree with this approach? Or agree? So out of position, don't like that approach because they never let go, for example, 9s or 10s. So what happens? Are you going to turn your kings into a bluff catcher? I think I don't know if we need to make that assumption that everybody with 9s or 10s is going to raise us on that board. And if they do, you know what? We're probably going to have to give up. So be it. I mean, that's the advantage of them being in position. And they may float us as well. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, if we check, they may bet those 9s and 10s anyway, and we're most likely going to have to give up. So, look, is it the perfect thing to do in every single scenario? Of course not. That's why I said, like, we could get into scenario upon scenario, and this session would be about 5 hours long. In general, this is my approach. 9s or 10s, if a guy's flattening you there and wants to call on the flop, that's the advantage of being in position as well. But think about what your goal is there. How much are you willing to risk with kings on an ace-high board? Don't be afraid to let it go. More often than not, if somebody is going to be firing away on those boards, they're going to have the ace, especially on a dry board. And I'm not willing to risk a ton with my kings there. It's, again, one of those situations you're going to either lose big or win small. All right. So let's go through some examples. I don't have an example of every single thing we went through in here, but a lot of just some bet sizing stuff, some delayed c-bet stuff, some double barrel stuff. So let's jump into it. Alrighty. So a lot of these are from 9-man and 6-man games. It really doesn't matter for the most part. So we raise here. So what are you guys typically doing on this board? What are you guys typically doing on this board? Now, granted, this guy's stats are not refreshed. Give me 1 second. All right. Every time I click 2 times on the show player stats, it ends up freezing my Hold'em manager. So I'll just let it go. It'll kick in essentially. Um, I agree. A lot of this is a little bit player dependent. We are, this is a 6-man game actually, so we're approaching the bubble. Um, I mix up my plays here. I'll be honest. If this opponent is folding to a C bet 100% of the time, I think we should C bet. If this opponent is pretty aggressive, these are those boards where I am concerned about getting check raise. So here we go. So stats popped up. So his fold to C bet, he's folding 2 out of 3 times. And maybe I didn't even have that stat. Who knows? But this is what I'm talking about. A lot of our information against these guys we barely have any hands on, it's going to be pretty incomplete. And it's going to be tough to get a ton of information. So another point to talk about in this is a little caveat to this whole thing. Of course, game flow matters. Did we c-bet 5 times in a row before? Did we not? We're obviously treating each hand in a vacuum here because we didn't see what happened previously in the game. And to be honest, I don't remember what happened in this game. It was from 10 days ago. I can't remember what happened yesterday, let alone 10 days ago. So, I don't know what happened before this. I wouldn't say c-betting's wrong. These could be one of those boards where I do a delayed c-bet. I think I may do that here. Yep, so I'm always concerned with these types of boards. Maybe he's got a flush draw that he will check raise me with. Maybe he's just got any pocket pair that he check raises. So then comes a 5. This is one of those scenarios. Did we pick up some outs? Of course, we picked up a 4 for an out. That's not our goal here. The checking back when you have outs is more when you, like if I c-bet the flop and I picked up a ton of outs on the turn, that's when I would check back. That doesn't really apply here. So I decide to do a delayed c-bet, and he goes check check. I don't care that I have outs. I know I have ace high. I have some showdown value. I don't want to give him, any more outs to even hit his hand. Excuse me. So this is where I would just do a delayed c-bet. It's kind of like the limb steal. No matter, we're not looking to hit our hand. We're looking for the path of least resistance, and we're looking to fire out half pot. So what are you guys thinking about with your bet sizing here? So I already know, look, we're betting out this flop. How big are we betting? Or betting out this turn. How big should we be betting? $325, $350 to 400. Yeah, like this is one of those times where I don't even think it's not appropriate to bet 50% or more. I hope I bet in like the 325, 350 range. I think that's what I should do. Because think about how the hand's played out. Think about the size of the pot. Do we need to bet 50% or more to represent this hand or to get him to fold whatever he's got? And you know what the other thing is here? Maybe he picked up a club draw. We can charge him for that draw, check back the river, and we might actually get some value as well. So 335 was right in between. So there we go. So that's where I definitely like that play. And like I said, is c-betting wrong? No. This is, again, it's not you have to do it this way. It's another play to throw in and understanding why you're doing it. Say we bet here, he calls and a spade comes, and is he checking back the river? If he checks back the river, then I'll check back ace high could have showdown value there. So if I have showdown value, I'm not going to turn my hand into a bluff then. If you sit there and you have like 7 high, then we can argue for barreling the river because we have no showdown value now. But Ace high alone, even if you had like, well, pocket fours, we probably would have c-bet, but um, when you have showdown value, don't turn your hand into a bluff. If I hit the straight, I'd probably bet out. If he checks the river, I'll probably bet out. I mean, I'm not going to put him on a flush. we could get into the what if game the entire time. I don't know. Maybe I would fold to that. Maybe I would call. You know, that's not really the point. I mean, we hit our straight. If it turns out to be a cooler, then it turns out to be a cooler. The guy didn't really play it like he had a flush draw necessarily. All right, so we race here with ace nine. Again, you'll see. I found out when I was going through these hands, I tend to do this maybe more than I should on paired boards. Um, is this the? Yep, these are the right stats. Very similar as before. Check it back. He goes check, check. And we bet out 125, significantly less than 50% of the pot. I know we have a flush draw here, but again, my goal is to take down the pot right there. All right, so I decide to c-bet here in this hand. Now, maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I didn't know this at the time. Actually, this is early in the game, so I would have not had these stats on me at the time. This is probably over the course of the game. This is what happened. So we're going to assume pretty much zero stats here. I c-bet half the pot. He calls. Here's your prime example of a really good time to c-bet. He could simply have a draw. Maybe he's got a pocket pair. Maybe he has a 10. I'm firing out, I'm firing out a double barrel here on the ace. So yeah, we picked up a gut shot. Maybe if we had a flush draw, we could potentially give ourselves a free card there. That could be one of those times where you don't want a double barrel. But pretty straightforward. Those are good times to double barrel. If you're not doing that and you're just giving up, I think you're also spewing away a lot of chips by never, always just c-betting and giving up if you get called. What do you guys think here? He's got, and so I probably do have these hands on him by this time. He's got a 50% fold to c-bet, 17% raise the c-bet, so we check raises. I think in this spot, I think this is probably a better spot to do a delayed c-bet than that first hand we went through. And obviously the ace is a great card to do it on, but regardless of what came out, I would have done this. And you can see the sizing. Look, we don't need to go to 800, 900. We don't need to go to 50%. The pot's pretty big. This sizing gets the job done. We didn't talk about it a lot, and I'll just, touch on it real quick. Bet an amount that, like I said, gets the job done. And like I said, I bet really small. And what betting small does, especially when you have a made hand, bet an amount that you think you're going to get called with. Get called from worse hands. Like if you have a set and the guy has top pair, you're most likely going to be able to get it all in at some point. So you don't need to bet big or whatever to make that happen. It'll happen naturally. What you're doing when you have that made hand as well and betting small is you're allowing second pair, potentially third pair, to call when you have that made hand as well. So another argument for betting small. Like I said, we can't get into it a ton, but just a point to discuss. So here we've got pocket threes. 10 high board is perfectly fine. Definitely c-betting that board. Again, we have some showdown value here, but he could have his beat right now, even if he's calling with a 5. So I don't know how much showdown value we have at this point, and the ace again is a good card to barrel. Again, doesn't need to be huge. It's just still left less than 50% of the pot. What do you guys think here? C-bet? Who votes C-bet? Yep. So I think it's a combination of our two comments here. I don't love the pot size here. If we bet, 300, 400, he's so likely to check raise this board. Yes, the hands we get to fold are the pocket pairs. There's no way they're calling. We could probably bet 200 and get a pocket pair to fold here, right? But we're also, a lot of his calling range might include Jack 10, Queen 10, those types of hands that are likely to check raises. So in this situation, on a board that's this juicy where I really do expect to get check raised a lot, I'm going to check it back. And look, if he does have that pocket pair, I'm still going to throw out a bet on the turn and hopefully still get those hands to fold still. And also, look, I have a couple outs here with the gut shot, maybe an ace is an out as well. Even though it's not going to be fun with 4 to a straight, but still, I think we get the point there. But on this type of board, with the stack sizes and what I'm actually going to end up getting to fold out, I think a check raise there, or sorry, delayed c-bet will prevent that. So the deuce isn't the greatest card in the world, especially if you had a pocket pair. But maybe even this is a little bit too big. Betting about 45% of the pot. But we get him to fold. So it's about understanding board texture, how your opponent's going to react to that board texture, and of course what's in his range. This is such an easy board to check raise with there's a lot of pairs and draws that are on this board here. So I'll give myself the outs in that scenario. You don't like the delayed c-bet, Olaf? That's fine. Let's. Why don't you like it? And by the way, I'm not saying that what is he really folding here? But I agree with that, 100%. Are you saying just check it down because we just have fold equity versus trash? The free gutter on the turn. I think that's not a bad play. I could have certainly done that. I think just discussing it, you might be right there that could be the better play. Certainly. Maybe I think that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple approaches to it. Like I said, my general play is probably to do with the late c-bet. Maybe I did it without even thinking. I could definitely see your point of just checking this back and continue to give ourselves outs because, maybe he's got, maybe that pocket pair still calls now. So it's a tricky scenario. Is he still going to fold, pocket fives? Would he have shoved pocket fives pre-flop? Given that, I don't know what to... Look, when this guy flats me, I have no idea what he's calling with based upon his stack size. So, you're right. He probably doesn't have small pockets there. Or maybe he does. I mean, I don't know what he has because this is such a random play from his stack size. I think I could just bet the turn smaller, if anything, or check it back. Well, the question is, it does hit his range. If he doesn't have pocket pair, if he doesn't have any one of these cards, I guess he's got ace X, some random hand. So it may not be the best spot, but playing against these random guys, it'd be interesting to see what the hell he was calling with that stack size pre-flop. Yeah, these hands are all merged. I figure I mix it up. All my other hands were on Poker Stars, so this is all merge. What do you guys think here? Yeah, I think we got to definitely c-bet. He calls. You guys double barreling this? He's barely ever, based upon his stats, maybe I was looking at that, he's barely ever folding on the flop. Half the time he's folding on the turn. So he's folding a little bit more on the turn. I think this may have been a better spot to potentially check it back. Yeah, I may not have paid attention to his stats. I'm not saying every hand I played here was correct either. But bet pretty small here. And we pretty much get him to fold. So I could have checked it back. I had some outs. This guy apparently, like I said, game flow is definitely an issue here. This is the same guy as before, so I have absolutely no idea. Looks like this guy is just calling everything. I can't put him on a calling range. It looks like it could be anything at this point. So since I know he's never folding on the flop, just whether we should bet the flop or not, I think this would be probably better to do a delayed c-bet on this type of guy, or double barrel for value as well. So that's what I mean. We could get into a lot of different scenarios to find out what's the most optimal, and probably these couple hands we could have made different plays that were better. It's all about just thinking about adding that delayed c-bet in when double barreling is correct. Given this guy, double barrel may not be bad. I'm going to skip this hand because it shows up later. This is a 9-man game. Okay, so let's talk about the scenario here. This is a 9-man game. We've got a pretty good stack. Look who's at our table here. The celebrity showing from Nicholas here. And so like I said, 9-man game. We're sitting in a pretty good spot with our stack. We have a short stack here, and we are called by a guy who has us covered. And fold to c-bet 1. So his fold to c-bet is 100%. It's over 1 time. Can't tell us any information. What do you guys think here? C-bet, check it back. All right. So I want to talk about this scenario. In general, I usually c-bet this board, and I c-bet most boards, right? Especially when I have top pair. I decided to check this back more for pot control, given the stack distribution here. This guy's got me covered. I don't necessarily want to start building this pot very big. I probably want to get maybe a street of value, maybe 2 really small streets, if anything. Bet small here, maybe bet small in the river, or just check it back because of this short stack. So an ICM, in my opinion, comes into play here, and the value of our chips. That with ace-3, I could potentially be giving him some outs here. I mean, I think you said dry board. Perhaps one is expected to bet that board 100% of the time. I to be honest, most guys when I'm playing on merge, I'm not balancing my range by any means. And I usually do c-bet this board, but I want to check this back more for pot control than anything. We could easily have the best hand here. Is he calling with an ace? Probably not. So I'll probably just bet small here for value. Do you plan to ever fold here? Potentially. Given the stacks, I would potentially fold. Again, table dynamics, do I know much about this guy? This guy doesn't seem too loose. Sure, it could be different games by all means, and it's different scenarios, game flow, obviously, where we're treating this as in a vacuum. In general, though, like I said, my concern here is the stack distribution at the table. So I think that's an okay time to just play a small pot with ace and a really shitty kicker. So that's my approach there. That's definitely more of a rarer scenario, but I think one worth pointing out. This is a 6 max game. What do you guys do here? I don't actually remember what I do here. Against this guy, it says 33% fold, so only 3 out of 9. He's folding. Maybe I saw that, maybe I didn't. End up checking. What do you think here? You think we should do a delayed c-bet or check it back? I could see myself doing both. I kind of forget what I do here. Two things. One is, if I had c-bet the flop, I most likely would have checked back this turn. This would probably be one of those prime examples to potentially check back the turn. I don't think that turn card helps us a ton. I don't think we can represent a much when we double barrel that turn. I mean, the 10 doesn't really do much for us to get any extra folds by any means. Right. So, give ourselves a shot at the flush or even an ace. I think I bet really small here. And we get him to fold. So, like I said, that's one of the reasons that, we could definitely check that back. One of the reasons I like to, if I bet the flop, I definitely check back that turn. When he goes check, though, that's my thing. Like, if I had c-bet the flop, I know he's got something. And then that 10 comes, I would 100% check back. When he goes check, I just think that it's weak in general, and I'm happy to take down the pot here, rather than, yes, we have showdown, yes, we have outs. I don't think we necessarily need the outs right now, because our hand could just be, we could just take it down right now and stop giving him extra cards as well. So we bet small here, and if he calls, okay, then we still get the river anyway. Yes, it's an issue if he check raises the turn. I guess if he has a 10, he could potentially do that, but I think that's just a small portion or small percent of the time that occurs. It's not necessarily about what we represent. Think about what he has as well. How many hands can he call with out of position? Maybe we're slow playing. Who knows? And the guy that's playing 46-12, is he not necessarily thinking a ton either? it's one thing to be playing against guys who are thinking players. Then we really have to, like on that board before with the ace high, or sorry, the top pair. If we're playing against really good players, maybe they wouldn't have flatted us to begin with, but we should probably continue to do what we would normally do when we have a made hand or not. Are these plays exploitable? Absolutely, but that's been the theme, the running theme of this whole course. We have to make exploitable. We have to leave ourselves open to be exploitable to maximize our own value against these players and to win the most money. Do I know that this is 100% the best play? No, I don't necessarily know that for a fact, but I'm basing it upon kind of the player population and the frequency at which I expect him to potentially hit this board, or a guy that's never folding. I think it's just better in general, path of least resistance, to just do a delayed c-bet. Yes, we pick up some outs on the turn, but do our outs really matter in this scenario? When he goes check check, isn't that just weakness and we could just take it down now and pick up 1,000 chips? I think that's my main focus here. And not to ramble on again, but I think it hammers home the point, the difference. If we had c-bet this flop, we c-bet to say 400, he calls, this turn comes, 100% check it back. I don't think we need the semi-bluff. I don't think we need to do any of that. We have some outs now. The 10 actually doesn't really make this hand better to double barrel, so I think that's the difference. So again, we get the fun 10 big blind flat. So before we even get into this hand, I don't remember what happens in this hand either. We have to also consider the players. A lot of what we're talking about is, what are these guys putting us on? Maybe they're thinking that. Majority of the time they're not, especially guys that are flatting us and we're playing post-flop. We're all facing these guys. Not everybody we're playing is going to be the thinking player and they know how to play post-flop as well. What do you guys think about this board? Yeah, I mean, he's got 33% full to a c-bet. Yeah, I think these boards, guys here can call with hands like 8-9, even ace-8. They have pocket pairs sometimes. They have a lot of random stuff. And they may not believe you. They may check raise a lot. This is a 9-man in the money, I believe. Or no. What are the beaver rooms? Sorry, I think this is 6-max bubble. Sorry. Yeah, 6-max bubble. And obviously a good card to bet out on, and we get him to fold. So, look, do you want to put him on a calling range? It's tough to do when guys are flatting with 10 big blinds and have these stats. It could be a lot of random crap. But that random crap could potentially hit. And I don't necessarily want to get check raised on this board very often. And he could also do that with potentially ace high. So that's it for the hands. Definitely some points of discussion. And when I go through here, I'm not saying that I'm doing this 100% right. We're all multi-tabling a lot. Looking at it in a vacuum, there's a lot of things to consider. Game flow is always an issue. I think it's good though to talk about these hands and talk about how we can do things a little bit differently. A delayed c-bet, when to do it, when it's good to do it. Could I have instead not done a delayed c-bet to just even check it back to river with some showdown value, like we talked about before with ace high? Yeah, sure, I could have. I think when it comes to the delayed c-bet, though, when somebody goes check check, whether what are we representing? We're not representing much usually, but when it goes check check, that just represents weakness, and let's take advantage of the weakness and let's pick up the pot. If we c-bet, we get called, and then we have to make a decision whether to double barrel. That's when it's okay. This guy hasn't shown weakness necessarily. He's shown he's got something he doesn't want to fold. Do we have outs by the time we hit the river? If yes, let's check. If not, then double barreling may be better in that scenario. Does that make sense, the difference, though, in why we would check the turn or bet the turn in the delayed C-bet versus a double barrel? All right. So that's kind of my approach to that. So, all right. Let's close that up. And oh, one other thing I wanted to, sorry, close you guys out. I think we could probably get to it potentially at the end, or we could do it now. I'll talk about it at the end. Let's jump into. So, any questions? We're going to jump into heads up stuff. Any questions on post flop play? Do you guys agree, disagree with some of the stuff? The double barreling, the delayed C-bet stuff? Makes sense? Post flop is always interesting. There's a lot of different ways to play it, a lot of different opponents, game flow, how we perceive our opponents and how they perceive us. Those are just some, I guess, things to consider. Maybe the delayed C-bets is maybe a new strategy, but here we go. So who's all seen this when it shows up? Who's all seen this chart? What do you guys think about this chart? Yeah, it's a Nash chart. I think we've all seen the lovely Nash charts. Do you guys use the Nash charts? Do you, when you were starting sit and goes, when you were playing heads up, did you find yourself using it? Do you use it now? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we're all kind of on similar paths here. Heads up play has always been an issue with many players, and it's often a highly discussed topic just in general. But I don't think there's been a lot of really in depth discussion on it either. And I wish we could get even more in depth. I mean, like I said, we're already at past an hour. That we could go on for hours about heads up play. And like I said, I'm going to make another video to give to you guys of some specific hands, running through scenarios of heads up play. But we're going to talk more about general strategies, kind of how we did with the C bets and double barreling. So yeah, we've all seen this chart for the most part. These Nash charts. If you're just starting with sit and goes, and you're just learning, by all means use this chart. It can help you. It's mathematically, technically unexploitable. We'll get into what that really means, but it can be a good way to get a grasp on how you should be playing heads up. And I also think it can be used for if you are playing really, really good opponents who you think are just maybe out exploiting you and just getting the better of you. Reverting these Nash charts can be a good idea as well. If you find that your game, you're just somebody simply better than you, which is fine. It's also good if you just simply look at your stats and your second place finishes are significantly higher than your first place finishes. I would then possibly go to this and get on this page. And what this chart really helps you do is, if Nash equilibrium is supposed to be unexploitable, or GTO, which is game theory optimal. If another person is playing this, there's no reason to deviate from it, so that nobody really gets an edge. Fine. Most players don't play game theory optimal, so we're going to be getting, essentially what I'm saying is we're going to be getting away from this Nash stuff. If you're using it, fine. What it essentially says is, when it says it's unexploitable and mathematically unexploitable, if you go into a heads-up match with 60% of the chips, you should win 60% of the time for the most part. And likewise, if you're going 40% of the chips, you should only win 40% of the time if you follow this. That's essentially what it says as well. But when you play this way, And when you just look at this chart and you say, okay, I've got 7, 9, and 10.8 big blinds, I should shove it all in now. If you play this way, regardless of who your opponents are, you are leaving massive amounts of equity and expected value on the table. And that's what, again, I think a lot of people do, and we need to get more into exploiting our opponent's tendencies. Now, that's certainly easier said than done. I've very rarely played heads-up sit-and-goes. Most of my heads-up play comes from just normal heads-up play from a 9-man or an 18-man or 45-man, whatever. And I think most of the people in here are very similar as well. So that when you get the heads-up play, the majority of the time you're in the 10 to 15 big blind range. You're playing a rebuy, you might be a bit deeper, but for the most part you're going to be in that range. When playing heads-up, it's the most difficult area to be in. I mean, in general, your edges are going to be slightly lower. Figuring out 3-betting ranges when all it is many times it's just all in or fold, or min raising and limping versus shoving. Like the shallow, with these stacks being so shallow in general in the games that we're playing, it makes navigating through the stage very, very difficult. Sometimes you're going to be right, sometimes you're going to be wrong, and like I said, edges in general are low. But how can we increase that edge a little bit? When you play Nash and Nash only, your edges will stay very, very low and very minimal. And like I said, if you are struggling heads up, go to Nash. Get on the right path, and then we can start deviating from it. So, of course, what we're going to be talking about today is how can we deviate, when can we deviate, against what opponents, and how do we approach each opponent. Here is my general approach heads up. And it's what I do versus every opponent. Essentially, I just test the waters. What am I getting away with? What are they going to allow me to do? And what we're going to talk about today is, and we're not going to get into it a ton because we actually already spoke about it a little bit, and it's about what we did in session 4, which is talking about raise folding, raise calling with 9 big blinds, 10 big blinds, 11 big blinds, that it doesn't always have to be push fold. We went through the equity calculations for in-game play, small blind versus big blind. The same concept applies here. Figuring out 3-betting ranges. Is someone's 3-betting range different than their all-in calling range, depending on your stack sizes? Maybe, maybe not. Remember, if there is not going to be much of a difference, or there's no perceived fold equity, then getting away with raise calling, raise folding, it might be more optimal. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's the other opponent has to be playing Nash as well. That's the point. You would want to stick with that if your opponent's playing close to Nash. I mean, if you're playing an ABC reg that you think is playing Nash, sure, you can look at that for calling to get an idea, and so I agree with that. But the majority of the time, most players are just simply not playing the most game theory optimal heads up play. And that's what it's for. It's for playing against other opponents like that. So, like I said, I test the waters. And testing the waters means this. By the time you get the heads up, you probably know the opponent that you're going up against. He's either the loose guy at the table, the reg at the table, whatever. But you still want to see what you get away with. Is this guy going to fold to your min raises? I wouldn't jump right into a heads up battle and just fold. And likewise, I probably wouldn't jump into a heads-up battle if I had 10 big blinds and just shove all in. I want to know, is this guy going to let me get away with a min raise? So I want to see how this guy's going to react. And then from there, as we start seeing him react to our plays, we can start adapting our game. Heads up is all about adapting. What you do the first hand should most likely not be how you're playing by the 20th hand, if it goes that long. Because each of you are probably adapting a little bit. But most, I will say, don't adapt at all. So if you adapt to these players, and I probably said adapt about 15 times here, if you start looking at your opponent's tendencies, you want to stay ahead of the curve, and most people are not quick enough to change up their game to what you're doing. So, just always want to be paying attention to tendencies. So let's talk about those tendencies. for example, this is what I mean by things might change from hand 1 to hand 20. If you min raise, being as we're all, regs in the games playing, we know that when we're in the small blind, or sorry, when we're on the button, we should be raising the button the majority of the time, right? Maybe even 100% of the time, and obviously that'll change. But like I said, we test the waters, we start raising. By the time our opponents, I'm sorry, let me back up. So we min raise several hands in a row, and our opponent folds every time. We then shouldn't start really folding out borderline hands or marginal hands. He's already told us that he's not going to be playing back at us unless it's a really good hand. Only at that point should we start deviating from our normal 100% small blind stealing, is when the opponent actually starts deviating as well. So what I like to do is start out each match, test the waters, but also based upon several assumptions. When you play against a fishy player, a loose player, we may not know anything about that specific player, but in general, if we lump him in with the general population of poorer players, we know they call way too much pre-flop and out of position. Okay? And we'll talk about playing against them in a second. Likewise, regs are not going to be calling, they're going to play 3-bet or fold. And also many times fit or fold, and maybe they're playing Nash themselves. Okay? So let's talk about the fishy players. When we talk about calling ranges, Paul, you asked, should we stick to Nash charts? Guess who's not playing Nash? The fish. I would never be calling as loose as Nash suggests many times versus fishy players. Be patient. I was in a game last night, and I was definitely not patient. I called off my stack with a rag ace against a slightly deep shove versus a really, really bad opponent. And after it, I was like, that was the stupidest call, because I think that I just let him off the hook. And that's what we don't want to do with the fishy players. Be patient with them. And along those same lines, when you are on the button, you don't want to raise every single hand into them. I think that's a leak, and that's an error, by raising every time you're on the button. Yes, being in position, it has its advantages, but because they're going to be calling so often, we should be folding out trash hands and actually limping some of those the middling hands, the 10-7s, 10-8s, those types of hands that can play okay post-flop, that we don't necessarily want to inflate the pot or have them shove over the top of us. So I look more towards limping when we're even 11 big blinds, 12 big blinds plus. So I wouldn't go into a heads-up battle and raise every single time versus a fishy player. I would still start out that way with everybody, because I've played against many guys that are really, really loose. Then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, heads up, they never defend. So figure out what opponent you're up against first. If you find that they're going to be the fishy player, kind of go by these types of rules. Another issue, and kind of what I fell into last night, was I think I 3-bet too light in that scenario. And 3-betting too light is often a mistake versus your fish. Because while they're aggressive, you also need them to be folding. And many times they're not folding enough. So when you're holding a hand maybe like King 10 and they're shoving for 12 big blinds, it may not be the best scenario to be calling your entire stack off versus them. They'll spew their chips to you at one point. Don't get too loose against them with your calling ranges or with your 3-betting ranges. Your 3-betting should contain more value hands. Those value hands can widen, but they should still be value hands nonetheless. And I would say, against the guys that are calling a ton, I'll probably resort to more shoving with my ace-x hands, pocket pairs, the broadways, the hands we want to shove with. I'll resort to shoving them with less than 12 big blinds. That makes sense. Any questions so far about the heads-up stuff? This is pretty much what we're going to be going through, is just approaching each opponent. And I'll give you guys a video later about some specific stuff. Alright, so let's talk about playing against regs. This is where I really want to utilize those session 4 strategies of raise folding, raise calling. Okay, 10 big blinds, 9 big blinds. What do they expect you to do? Expect you to shove. When you raise, many times they don't know how to react to it. Their 3-betting ranges usually aren't the same as their all-in calling ranges. And what that will allow you to do, just like we mentioned before, it'll give you the confidence when you're holding deuce 3 and 10 big blinds that you don't have to shove it all in. You can min raise the trash hands just like you min raised your premium hands. Okay? And 3-betting light now is a necessity, or you're going to get run over because most regs will be raising from the small blind the majority of the time. Now, this is what I was talking before about tendencies. So let's say we're playing a reg and we start out and we're raising the button a lot. Or sorry, we're the reg is raising the button and we're 3-betting pretty often. How does that reg deviate from what he was doing? Is he adapting at all? Or does he continue to keep raising? If somebody's raising the button 80% of the time, and then we start 3-betting accordingly, and I didn't get into a ton of ranges here yet, that'll be for another video, and we're 3-betting with an according range, which could be a really, really wide range, including connecting hands, if they're opening 80% of the time. If all of a sudden, after, let's say you 3-bet twice, they start folding and limping maybe more, and then they decide to raise, your 3-betting range has to change. It's not the same as it was before. So hand 20 is different than hand 1. Now, because our opponent's raising range has changed. Did they start raising, they go from raising 80% to 60%? That means our 3-betting range has to tighten up significantly. And not doing so would be a mistake. Does that make sense? But I think the most important thing here, though, is when you're getting into heads up, get into more of that raise fold, raise call strategy. We've already, like I said, gone through. I know there's the ICM is not calculated when we're talking about heads up, but we went through ICM calculations before about 3-betting ranges and all-in calling ranges, and the equity and dollar EV gained from playing this type of raise fold. Apply that to the heads up play as well if you're not already. Don't get into the habit of shoving so deep. I see so many regs, they just shove so deep, 12, 13, 14 big blinds against other regs. There's really no need to do that. And when you start doing that, you're giving up your edge big time. So along the lines of 3-betting, there's also going to be times where we flat. When should we flat versus 3-betting? I got in this conversation this morning in not even a heads up hand, but it was a discussion on whether we should have flatted with a pocket pair or shoved all in, 3-bet shoved all in. And a lot of the time, it was like, oh, we should shove all in, shove all in. The first question that you have to ask yourself is, what's our opponent's range of opening? And then we can figure out a 3-betting range accordingly. But also, whenever you're making a decision, that decision has to be made because we think it's better than the other decisions. So when a reg is raising 80-90% of the times from the button, it's probably a mistake to flat with Jack 10 suited. And if you're sitting there with 12 or 13 big blinds, or maybe even deeper than that, it's a mistake then to flat. It would be 3-betting. It would be better than flatting. If you're at a position but an opponent is opening up tighter, or you have a very loose, fishy player, then flatting with those middling hands, the 8-9s, maybe even like 10-7, hands like that, or even like a Jack 10, it can be a better decision to flat and play post flop. It's almost impossible to say what our equity is going to be post flop because we all play post flop differently. You might have more of an edge over your opponent post flop. So if you have that edge over your opponent, look to play some more hands post flop. That's fine. If you feel you can really crush them post flop. But those are just some reasons to do one or the other. So start thinking about ranges. Don't just you pick up King 9 and somebody raises and you decide to 3-bet shove because you think King 9's a good hand to 3-bet shove. 3-bet shove because my opponent's opening 70-80% of the hands. I most likely have the best hand here in general, and we have tons of fold equity. I know most of the time you're called, you're crushed, but fold equity is going to be playing a lot of the role there. So the first part is putting on a range, and I thought that putting somebody on a range would be kind of common sense, but I've gone through a lot of hand history reviews recently, and when people are deciding whether to 3-bet or not, people aren't really asking first, well, what's my opponent's range? In the hand we were talking about this morning, and some of the guys in here were involved in the chat as well. It was actually a 180 man, and it wasn't a heads up play at all, but it hammers home the point here. We were final table of a 180 man, several short stacks at the table. I think we were comfortably in second place in chips with maybe 15 big blinds, and the chip leader opened up from under the gun. I think we were 6-handed or so, and he opened up from under the gun, and we were holding pocket fives in the big blind. And the question was, should we shove or flat? And flatting would have been fine based upon the stack sizes. It didn't cost too much. And a lot of people said we should shove all in. And well, then the question is, well, why should we shove all in? Just because we have pocket fives, and if we're called, we have some fold equity, and if called, we have some equity that way. That was what the conversation went to, rather than the first question should be, well, what the hell is the guy opening with? What's his range that he's opening with? The guy who ended up posting the hand said we thought he was only opening like 10-15% of the hands there because he was pretty tight. If that's your assumption, there's no way you should be 3-betting pocket fives there into the chip leader. It would be massively negative EV given that the guy's a chip leader, has us covered, and there's short stacks at the table. So, applying that to heads up, don't just look at your hand and say this is a good hand to 3-bet all in. We have to put our opponent on a range, and two, and maybe not necessarily a range, but the frequency. The frequency at which he's raising the button. Is the guy limping sometimes, folding sometimes, and then deciding to raise sometimes? If that's the case, then those Jack-10 hands, they might be just come a flat, flat play, let's see if we can hit something and move forward from there and outplay and post-flop. If he's raising, then those 5-6, those Jack-10s, they become 3-bets. So look at the frequency and understand how that frequency changes. Once that opponent stops doing that and starts adding in more limps and folds, our 3-betting range then has to fold. And maybe we start flatting with those hands again. Is that cool, guys? Does that make sense? I know we're kind of dealing in some generalities, but I think these are important, at least, concepts to go through. Especially if you're struggling with your heads-up game. All right. So, some concluding thoughts. Newbies, start with Nash. It can be really good. And even if you are, less than 10 big blinds, it can be a good tool to use to understand how wide and how wide you should shove and potentially how wide you should call. So I don't think you can go too wrong there. But you need to mix up your play. When you're at even 10 big blinds, 11 big blinds, there's other things you can do than just according to Nash to gain maximum profits. That's what our goal should be, and it shouldn't be to just minimize our edge by playing straightforward Nash against other opponents who aren't playing Nash to begin with. So don't think that this unexploitable idea is actually making you money either and figuring that nobody can gain an edge over you. They certainly can if you are playing Nash. So we need to mix up our play. And like I said, when you're heads up, test the waters, figure out who you're up against, that general population of players, and apply the idea you have about that player. If it's a fishy player, use what we know about how fish generally play heads up and move forward with that assumption until you start seeing some tendencies from your opponent. And a few rules of thumb when you're heads up. Like I said, against loose fishy players, 3-bet for value, don't raise every button, and just be patient. You'll catch them. Just be patient. Against those regs, you will have to do the 3-betting light and often, but also understand how they change up their game. And when there are certain hands, like when you have like 11, 12 big blinds, it will get to a point where raising might induce some wider 3-bets. So it can be an okay time to jam all in your ace-x hands and your small pocket pairs, because you don't necessarily want to induce with, say, your opponent has like Jack 9, because it has close to 50%. I think it's like greater than 47% equity versus your Ace X type of hand. So it's okay when you're heads up to shove the Ace X hands, to shove the pocket pairs. If you think that your opponent's 3-betting range might start getting a little bit wider, then they're all in calling range. So you can be a little bit unbalanced and jam those hands, but also balance your min raising hands with your junk hands, or balance your junk hands with your premium hands with min raises. When you have 9, 10, 11 big blinds, don't just make it all in or folds. So that's kind of the the heads up general strategies. And of course, if you get into post flop play, it's a little bit different when you're heads up, but you can use some of the stuff that we spoke about before. Some delayed C bets, double barreling. Obviously you'll get into some more post flop play as well when you're heads up. So guys, any questions? This is technically our last session. Like I said, I guess I'll call it a bonus video. I'll do some specific heads up stuff. I've already got some heads up videos. I will be giving everybody access to all the other videos as well now that we're done. So I'll talk to you guys after about that. And I hope that you've gotten some value out of this course. I hope some of the stuff is new and that you'll be able to add it into your game and get that extra edge that's needed. In today's environment, games are getting tougher, whether you're playing 180 mans or 18 mans or 9 mans. Games are certainly getting tougher. There's more regs. There's more guys out there coaching, making videos, all that good stuff. So people naturally learn. So hopefully this will help you get that edge over your opponents and increase your ROI even as games are getting tougher. So I thanks for everybody joining in. Does anybody have any questions? Any questions? All right.